Just a thumbs up. Good evening. My name is Robert Walker. I'm National Director for Hasbara Fellowships Canada. We are a leading pro-Israel campus advocacy organization created in 2001 and active coast to coast. Tonight, I want to welcome those of you in person as well as joining us on Facebook Live. Today, we have a very special guest, Amanda Hohmann, the Executive Director with La'ad Canada. Amanda is the former National Director for B'nai B'rith's League of Human Rights, and today, of course, as I mentioned, serves as the Executive Director for La'ad Canada. And Amanda certainly will explain a little bit in terms of some of the very important work that La'ad, very new, has already accomplished. And tonight, very briefly, the purpose of tonight about the Indigenous rights and the Indigenous character of the Jews in the land of Israel, I think explores something that very few people, both pro-Israel and anti-Israel, and certainly those in the middle, don't know. In other words, how do we truly know, beyond the legal arguments, beyond the factual arguments of the Jews' historical and political rights in terms of self-defense, but beyond that, how do we know why was it that the Jewish people had their reconstituted home in the land of Israel and not Uganda or Wyoming or anywhere else? So what is it specifically about that? And tonight, Amanda was critical, and I'm saying this because she won't say this about herself, but Amanda really was critical in not just popularizing this understanding of Jews as indigenous people of the land of Israel, but really creating, I think, the academic grounding behind it. And this is a tremendous, I wouldn't even call it an argument because it's not an argument, it's a reality. But this is something that certainly pro-Israel advocates and pro-Israel Canadians need to become familiar with. So without further ado, Amanda.
Thank you, Rob. So welcome everybody here in person. Welcome everybody who's watching either at home now or in perpetuity. So I'll give you a little bit of a background about myself. So as Rob said, I'm formerly with B'nai B'rith Canada. I've been doing advocacy for the better part of 15 years. I started out as a First Nations advocate, and so I'm from Northern Ontario, was doing advocacy for First Nations groups in Northern Ontario, learned a lot about Indigenous advocacy that way, and have sort of tried to take some of what I learned and what I did for other groups and apply it to my advocacy on behalf of the Jewish people. A little like 2-minute about myself. Before I started doing advocacy as my day job, I have not always been a religious Jew. I was raised in Northern Ontario, didn't know I was Jewish until I was an adult. And the reason for that is because my family hid our Judaism. So my family came from Germany and hid when they came to Canada the fact that we were Jewish. And so for me, my advocacy work is sort of an extra, it takes on an extra component because 2 generations of my family did nothing. And for me, it's an extra sort of stick at the people who stopped my family from being Jews. And so for me, it's really important to not only, be as Jewish as I can in terms of a religious sense, because that's for everybody to come to themselves, but to be as much of an authentic Jew in my identity as a Jew and my identity as an Indigenous person in Israel is really important to me. So that's where I'm coming from. That's my background. I'm also a former professor for a number of years, so I love to, share ideas, and I'm a PhD student now, so like ideas are really what I trade in. So by all means, jump in with comments, questions. For people watching on Facebook, if you have a question, type it please in the little discussion window at the bottom, and one of my lovely assistants will let me know what the question says, and I'll do my best to answer it. So as Rob said, at La'ad, one of our biggest things has been to bring the idea of Jewish indigeneity to a wider audience. It was sort of the founding purpose of our organization. It's one of the major pillars of what it is that we do. And over the past year, we've spoken to a lot of people about this, a lot of politicians and decision makers and that kind of thing, to try to get some of the people who determine Canada's policy and policy of other sort of Western countries and Western organizations, excuse me, to understand why this is so important. And so tonight I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on what it means to be Indigenous, and then we're going to talk about why Jews qualify. So a lot of people, when I start talking about Jews being Indigenous to Israel, and I don't mean, just right off the bat, I don't mean, you know, I don't have a map of Israel handy, but I don't mean the little, you know, strip of land that we consider Israel today, because that's modern day borders. I'm talking Nile to Euphrates, as it says in the Torah, in the Tanakh. It says that is Israel. That's where we're from. Okay, so that's what our people have said for thousands of years. That's our space. So I just want to put that out there. When I say Israel, I don't necessarily mean current borders. So when we're talking about being Indigenous, indigeneity is used wrong a lot of the time. People in sort of everyday conversation tend to use it as where you're born, where you are from, right? And that's the biggest argument that I get when I start talking about this. People will say, Jews aren't Indigenous to Israel, Jews are from Poland, right? Well, some Jews are from Poland, not all Jews are from Poland. Indigeneity means where your people became a people, in very short definition. I'm going to go into it a little bit in more detail, but the one-liner, where did your people become a people? Okay, so for Jews, how can we suggest that's anywhere other than Israel? It's pretty clear. Even if you think, you know, and I've heard this a lot of times, well, fine, you're quoting your holy book. I think it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo, right? That I don't believe in Hashem. I don't think that that's true. I don't, you know, God is a made up concept and your holy book is written by people. Very nice, maybe it is. However, it's still thousands of years old. And it's still a document from the beginning of our people. And I don't think you can dispute that, right? So when we're talking about indigeneity, there's a few key criteria. There's no, you know, one definition that everyone uses. For sake of argument, I'm going to use the UN definition tonight, because the UN is, you know, our sort of perpetual best friend as Jews, right? So I'm going to use their own definition that the UN uses. So when the UN is determining who is Indigenous and who is an Indigenous person, there are 6 criteria. The first one is, does that group have a common language? Jews, I think we can all agree, have a common language. What do we daven in, right? What is the Jewish language for as long as there's been Jews? Hebrew, right? There might be other, you know, Yiddish and Ladino and all of that, but there is one common language that all Jews everywhere from the time of the beginning of Jews till now share, and that's Hebrew. So point 1, check. Does the second point, do the people have ties to the land in which they're claiming to be Indigenous and historical continuity to that place? Well, again, I think we can say yes, solidly, for Israel and Jews. Our ancestors are buried there, right? Right back to our patriarchs. We can say this is where the first of our people were buried. We can point to the spot, right? All of our history as a people took place in that area. So if you look back at the origins of the Jewish people, our origin stories as a people, they take place in Israel, all of them. Our holiest sites are in Israel, all of them, right? So how can you make a suggestion that we don't have a tie to that land? I don't think anybody would say that, right? Even the people who want to claim that it's maybe not ours still recognize that we have some, you know, historical ties there. In the Tanakh, Israel is mentioned 641 times. So pretty strong evidence that we might have a connection with the land, right? So some other ways that Judaism is connected specifically with the land of Israel. We pray facing Jerusalem. There's dozens of mitzvot that can only be done in Israel. Our holiest site and sites are in Israel. According to some, and I mean, this is not for me to tell you one way or the other, but according to some, it's halakha that Jews have to live in Israel. I mean, it's a discussion, right? Each year on Passover, we stay. Next year in Jerusalem. So our entire understanding of us as a people is centered around the land of Israel. So do we have a tie and historical continuity? Check. So the third criteria, a common culture, social system, and religion. Well, religion, right off the bat, we can say yes, right? Common culture. This one is trickier to nail down, but I think if you look at, there are certain things that make Jews Jews. For example, and again here I'm going to use some religious examples because we're an ethno-religious tribal people. All of our culture comes from a basis in our religion. So even if you're not a religious Jew, you probably still have some version of a Seder. You probably still have a bris for your son. You probably still, you know, when you enter a shul, you'll still put on a kippah. There's lots and lots and lots of cultural artifacts that are constant amongst all populations of Jews. Whether or not you're religious, whether or not you are, you know, from Syria or Israel or Poland or Brooklyn. There are things that all Jews do. Social systems, the same thing, right? There is a certain social system, right? There's a certain understanding and type of respect paid to a rabbi, for example, right? There are certain roles that you need to have filled in a Jewish community, no matter where you are, religious or not, right? So, check. That was criteria 3. Criteria 4, self-identification as Indigenous. Well, we as Jews don't do this so well right now. And I think this is the only one I can't prove to you that we are. And this is only because of us. We're our own worst enemies on this one. But, so we're going to leave number 4 aside for a second. Number 5, a resolve to maintain their ancestral way of life or beliefs. I think we can all agree that every generation of Jews says, this generation, referring to young people, isn't doing enough, right? This generation isn't keeping X, Y, Z, right? I'm sure if you ask your grandparents, you know, their grandparents said, you're not doing enough. You're not keeping X. You're not doing X, right? It's very, very important to us as Jews that our children should continue to do Judaism, to be Jews, to maintain a Jewish way of life. It's very important. And it's one of the first discussions that Jews have whenever Jews are around, right? Whenever we gather, there's always a discussion about, you know, intermarriage and you know, people are doing this and doing that and whatever. So I think that's a pretty big check mark, right? And the last one, interestingly, is that they have to be the non-dominant group in society. Now, this is not because of anything other than every Indigenous population everywhere in the world that the UN is interested in dealing with. They're dealing with it because they've been displaced as the dominant group. There is no other place where the Indigenous people of that region who want to have rights as an Indigenous people are the dominant group. Jews in Israel are a model for those other Indigenous groups. We are the only Indigenous people who, after like hundreds or thousands of years of exile, have reclaimed our ancestral land. One of my good friends, Ryan Belrose, who I've worked with for years, and oh, is he watching? Hi, Ryan. One of my good friends, Ryan Belrose, talks about, he's an Indigenous activist, he's First Nations, he's Métis, and he talks about the importance of other Indigenous groups taking a cue from Jews in Israel, and that we should be looking at Jews and our reclamation of our ancestral lands when we're talking about how to advocate for other Indigenous groups around the world. Because Jews really are a model, right? Nobody else has ever done this. Nobody else has ever lost their ancestral lands and then gotten it back and become the dominant group again. So, I mean, that one, I think, doesn't apply here, only because we're a unique case. But every other one of these criteria, I think we can all agree, and this is the UN's own criteria. This isn't, you know, something I've written to make it convenient for me that we would slot ourselves into this box. There are more convenient criteria. So even by the UN's own definition, we are the indigenous people of Israel. If you look at using this same checklist, I'm not going to get into it per se right now, but if you look at this same checklist with some other groups who might be claiming indigenous status in the region, it doesn't hold up, right? Ties to the land and historical continuity. Their history as a people, which is sketchy to begin with, does not mention the land of Israel, right? I'm not going to get into all of the check boxes. We can talk about that in the questions, but you know, the only people who meet these criteria in the land of Israel is the Jewish people. And so I think it's really important, you know, I mentioned that it's important for other people. It's important that we are strong in our indigenous identity because it helps other groups as well. It helps for us to be a good model and a good leader for other people to follow. But it's really important for us as Jews as well to know that this is where we are from, to believe that we are the indigenous people, and to understand that that means that this land is ours, regardless of, you know, we can have the legal rights argument, and we can talk about the Balfour Declaration, and we can talk about this, and we can talk about that, and the legal this, and the legal that, and the justification, and, you know, who gave what to who and borders and whatever. Irrelevant. It is ours. We can talk about where the borders lie. Fine, that's for politicians. I'm not a politician. I'm a Jew who cares about my ancestral homeland. And at the end of the day, I think we all have to have that as our starting point, and then we can build out from there. And so with that, Mr. Walker, if you have questions you would like to, we can have a little discussion.
Sure, thank you. Let me present to you something that somebody said to me.
Okay.
He said, you know, this is all very well and good, but even according to your own creation myth, right, the Torah, that this exact words, he said, you displaced the Canaanites.
Sure.
You know, you were not the first people there. You know, according, like you said, according to your own sort of written tradition, the Jews were not the, you know, ancestral, in other words, the very first people there. So maybe you can help us understand sort of, you know, so you talked about, you know, that indigenous doesn't necessarily, indigenous essentially means that that's where your people became a people. But is there a sort of a wrench in the argument that, well, what if there was another people there first? The Canaanites might not be around anymore, but what if they were? And is that an issue whether they were or not?
Okay, so good question. I thought you were going somewhere else with that. We can get into that other question that I thought you were going to ask after. Excuse me, no is the short answer. No wrench. And the reason there's no wrench is because it's irrelevant to me if someone else wants to claim that they're from there. It doesn't matter to me if there's another population that was there before or thereafter or there, whatever. If they started there as an indigenous people, and I don't know enough about the history of the Canaanites, frankly, I don't know that anybody does, to say that that was their indigenous land. How do we know that they didn't move into there from somewhere? I don't know. But even if that is where they're from, it's irrelevant to me. That's where my people became a people. So other people's history is irrelevant to me. It doesn't matter. There are no Canaanites now to challenge me for the land. So that doesn't matter. That part of the argument doesn't matter. We're not talking about who gets what sliver of Israel because they're not there. So it doesn't matter. Them being there before, after, during, whatever, the creation of Jews as a people is also irrelevant because it doesn't take away from the fact that that's where we became a people. So I mean, yeah, I hear that argument all the time. The only people who could maybe challenge us for the rights to, you know, being the indigenous people of Israel is the Canaanites, and there's none. So,
you know, so I hear the point. So I guess really that the question we ask then is, so what is then the value? In other words, what is the goal and understanding? I mean, beyond sort of an academic understanding that, okay, you know, the Jewish people, this was the formative place where their culture, their religion, you know, their ethnicity, their language came together. But, you know, circa 2018, you know, sitting in North America or even in Israel, what's the significance maybe on a geopolitical level? In other words, somebody might say, well, you know, the fact that Jews are indigenous there, but if that doesn't in no way precludes the indigeneity of another people, without discussing the indigeneity of the, you know, of the Arab people or of the Palestinians, without touching that, what is sort of the value then in understanding this if, you know, if it doesn't sort of lay claim to the land, then what does it tell us beyond that this is where the Jewish people became a people?
Okay, well, first of all, I think it does lay claim to the land, number one. Number two, just to address something you said, the indigeneity of the Arab people, Arabs are from the Arab Peninsula, right? The Arabian Peninsula is where they're from. That's where they're indigenous to. That's why they're called Arabs. So it is important to talk about that, right? That by their own definition of themselves as a people, they are from this part of the land. I'm not talking about any sort of right to long-standing presence in Israel. That's a whole other discussion we can have if you want. But it is important to talk about who is indigenous to where, because I can't come into Canada and say, well, I'd like for this to be my indigenous land. I really like Canada. Listen, it's more temperate than Israel. Nobody's trying to blow us up. There's more space. It's easier to grow stuff here. There's lots of fresh water. There's lots of natural resources. We've got oil. We've got this. Like, I think Canada's better for the Jewish people. This is where I'm indigenous to. That doesn't work, does it? I can't just come in and say that this is now mine. Of course, it matters where you're from and where you're indigenous to, because that is your land. You don't get to go and claim other people's. So the same way as we wouldn't accept somebody coming in today and saying, listen, Canadians, and I mean, that's a whole other discussion about whether we Canadians can even, anyway. But we wouldn't accept somebody coming in today and saying, this is now my land, get out. I've decided I'm from here, this is mine, get out. You would say, no, this is my land. This is, you know, the indigenous people in Canada make this argument, this is mine. I'm sorry, you can't have it. And we respect that. You know, whether or not we're doing a good job as Canadians is another thing entirely. And I think lots of people around the world, particularly bodies like the UN, anybody interested in human rights, I think we are now, you know, there's a lot of discussion about post-colonialism. How do we make reparations for the fact that there was a colonialist enterprise happening from, you know, the Western world, you know, Britain and France and Spain and all of those folks, to say nothing of the Muslim world. But how do we make reparations for the fact that we displaced indigenous people in multiple areas? You know, we're talking about Australia, we're talking about North America for sure, we're talking about South America. How do we make reparations for that? We have an entire body of our government in Canada dedicated to making reparations for the fact that white Europeans came in and took the land from the First Nations people of Canada. Of course, it's important to talk about who had it first and who owns it and what your rights are there.
I mean, you know, so you raise an interesting point, because you say, you know, you talk about, you know, formerly known as Indian Affairs here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a government department specifically aimed at, you know, relations with Canada's native population and reparations and reservations and so on. But the fact that there doesn't exist, you know, maybe to sort of pivot to a bit of a political issue. So if this is the case, in other words, if even by the United Nations' own sort of self-definition of what constitutes an indigenous people, mm-hmm. you know, common language, common, you know, background, et cetera, mm-hmm. and without precluding, again, without even discussing whether the Palestinians or the Arabs, you know, have that claim, without even touching that. So why is it then, maybe on a political level, beyond sort of anti-Semitism, which absolutely could play a role, but why has this been so resisted by, let's say, international bodies, beyond perhaps that we haven't articulated it well, which is a valid critique, but, you know, in your work, when you've, you know, articulated this to, let's say, undecided individuals, you know, why haven't they bought into this before? It seems so self-evident.
I think, to me, it was self-evident. So when I started doing Jewish advocacy, I was like, why are we not talking about that, though? That's point one. Like, before we get into anything else, that's point one. Why is that not how we're starting every discussion? I think the reason it's not being accepted by institutions or government bodies or organizations or whoever else you want to talk about, because nobody's saying it. Nobody said it. Nobody's told them we are the indigenous people. Nobody has used the language that matters. We might have said Israel is ours, but we also call ourselves white people. If we're calling ourselves white people and then we're saying Israel is ours, we become white colonizers, right? I think it's very important to talk about yourself in the context of, I am indigenous to the land of Israel. I myself was born in Canada. I'm not Israeli. My husband is, but I'm not. I was born in Canada, right? My family, I just told you, my family came from Germany. Before that, a long time ago, they came from Israel. It's just the reality. You would never say to a Chinese person who came to Canada, they have a child, and then a grandchild, and then a great-grandchild, and then a great-great-grandchild. And, you know, let's talk about 7 generations later. You're not going to tell that Chinese Canadian that they are Indigenous to Canada. Of course not. They're Indigenous to China. You're not going to say that they're Indigenous to Canada just because they've been here for 7 generations. You're going to say, no, it's very nice, but you're not an Indigenous Canadian. I'm not an Indigenous Canadian, even though 1/2 of my family has been here since the founding of Canada. 1/2 of my family helped to found Quebec City, which was like the first major city in Canada. I'm not an Indigenous Canadian. I can't make that claim, despite the fact that my family has been here as long as white people have been here. So, or, you know, non-Indigenous people. So I think it's very important to realize that, number one, nobody has ever said this stuff. When we've talked to politicians, when we've talked to decision makers, and even, you know, some Israeli officials, they are completely confused by this discussion. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, no one has ever said this to them. So how can we expect bodies like the UN to accept that we're Indigenous if nobody has ever said it to them? They're not going to come to this on their own. But I think there's also, you know, you said, without talking about anti-Semitism, listen, there's a particular maybe motivation to not wanting Jews to be in Israel, and I think we all know what that is, right? We're a little island of Jews surrounded by a hostile land. So of course they don't want us there, because then they get the monopoly on the whole place. It makes good sense. So aside from the fact that let's look at who's making the decisions at the UN, let's look at who's the most vocal critics of Israel at the UN, and why it might not be in their best interest to accept, you know, Jews as the Indigenous people. I think we as Jews have never said it. So who's going to advocate on our behalf, right? If nobody tells anybody, fine, we're all from Homeland.
So, you know, okay, so, you know, in terms of, you know, when we don't articulate it well, I think that's a valid critique. I think it's critical that, you know, we learn how to articulate, understand it and articulate it. But how, in terms of those who are, let's say, more antagonistic or critical, you know, what are maybe some of the arguments that are made to help refute it? You know, for example, what might occur to me, or what I might have heard, you know, is that even the perception that, like you said, Amanda, that Jews are Caucasian, or that, you know, Jews perhaps don't fit the stereotype of how we think of Indigenous people. You know, Jews are primarily in North America. You know, we speak English. We're not first generation. We're typically, I mean, we don't look like people who people tend to think Indigenous people look like.
Sure.
We physically, for the most part, look Caucasian. Like I said, you know, we have, you know, very anglicized last names for the most part, etc. Do you think that harms us, or what do you think are the more, so 2 questions. 1, do you think that harms us in terms of makes it more challenging to make the argument on a superficial level? And 2, what are the arguments that, let's say, those who argue against the Jewish people's indigeneity, what do they argue when presented with an argument like yours, or the reality that, you know, here are the facts behind the Jews' Indigenous status?
Okay, so first of all, I think, yes, it harms us that, listen, if you ask an anti-Semite, you ask a neo-Nazi, are Jews white? What are they going to say? No, Jews are not white. I'm from, you know, England and Scotland, and I can trace my ancestry back to the 1500s. I'm white. Jews are not white. That's what they're going to say, right? So I think that's the first point. The suggestion that, you know, Jews are all white people is only applied when it is useful to say they should get out of Israel. Because when we're not talking about Israel, Jews are not white people. When we're talking about Canada and North America, Jews are not white. Jews are Jews, white people are white people. We only say that Jews are white when it's helpful to the narrative to get them out of Israel. So I think we need to start pointing that out as Jews. I think we need to start saying, well, listen, which one is it? It can't be both. When it's convenient for you, I'm one, and then I'm another one, it's more convenient, right? So I'm either white or I'm not. And I can tell you, I normally wear a tickle. I wear a scarf. I don't normally wear a sheitel. I don't know. Anyway, so I can tell you when I'm walking down the street in a scarf on my head, I am not a white person. I do not get treated like a white person. with the Shaitalon depends on the area I'm in and if they can tell I'm a Jew. But I don't get treated like a white person in a scarf. And so I'm sorry, I don't buy the argument that Jews are white people. We are white people if we can pass as white people, and that's an important point. Because I know a number of First Nations people, my good friend Ryan, who's watching right now, who can pass as white people. They get treated as white people as long as nobody knows that they're Indians. As soon as somebody knows you're an Indian, you get treated like an Indian, right? Same way as, you know, African Americans in the South of the US. If you can pass as a white person, you get treated in a particular way until people know that you're not, and then you get treated differently. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that you had used the word Caucasian to describe white people. I think that there is an important distinction between white and Caucasian, because Arabs, Jews, and Semitic peoples of all kinds are actually Caucasian, but are not considered white under the U.S. definition of white. Sure.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I was using white. Rob used Caucasian. You're right. So I maybe made a leap there in assuming what you meant. But yeah, 100%. And so I think, you know, it definitely harms us that we allow those two things to both be true, right? And of course, especially in the generation of, say, my grandparents, or of, you know, first generation people in Canada, you're dealing with tremendous anti-Semitism. You want to be accepted like every other white Canadian. So of course you're going to accept being called white because it's better for you at the time, right? You want to be like every other white Canadian because it allows you certain privileges that you don't get if you're not. So I think, you know, as much as it was important then, and I would never fault anybody for that, as much as it was important then to be accepted as white, I think now it's harming our efforts internationally in terms of our sovereignty in Israel. I think the discussion that Jews are white people is actually harmful to our claim on Israel, because we're talking about dealing with a post-colonial system. We're talking about making reparations for, you know, colonial, conquests, this is the word I was looking for, all over the world, right? So we're dealing with trying to, everywhere, give back land to Indigenous people and to try to make up for the fact that, for the most part, Western Europeans took over a good chunk of the world, right? And so it's very difficult if you are being viewed as a white person to then say, but I don't have to give my conquest back, right? So I think it's difficult.
Right, and you know, I raised the point only because, of course, you know, there are, you know, like I said, there are Caucasian Jews, there are Black Jews, there are Asian Jews, and, but I think that typically in North America, you know, Jews are viewed a certain way, and I think, you know, in a visibility perspective. So, but tell me about, you know, if you were to present this to somebody who's antagonistic, who says that, you know, you know, the Jews have no historic homeland, that, you know, they marched in, you know, there might have been Jews there a couple thousand years ago, but, you know, they basically left, much like the Canaanites, the Hittites and the Jebusites, Moabites, okay, they were fantastic, all very well and good, they used to be there, but they left, they were exiled by the Romans, very tragic. And basically in 1948, you know, the European Holocaust Guild put, you know, all sorts of, okay, very nice that, you know, thousands of years ago, you know, Jews had that Semitic connection, but for 2,000 years they've been Poles. For 2,000 years they've been Russians, and they've been Germans. So
much to say about this.
Yeah, but in a nutshell, what would they, I mean, you know, perhaps, you know, that's how I hear it on a political level, but how would they dispute specifically the claim of indigeneity? Do they say that it doesn't matter anymore, or that the Palestinians have a greater claim? And Mahmoud Abbas said there were, you know, that Jesus was a Palestinian, the dinosaurs were Palestinian, right? How far back do we need to go here?
I think, well, that was a lot that I have to unpack. Yes, so your first question of what would they say, what you just said. They would say what you just said, because they have said what you just said. I get that all the time, that, you know, well, there might have been Jews in Israel then, but the Jews were all exiled, they all left. And so, like, sorry about your luck, but you've all lived in Poland for the last 2,000 years. You're not from the Middle East, you're a bunch of white people, and out you go. What I say to that is, well, there's my husband right there. First generation to live in Canada. As far back as there's records, his family is from Israel. So, or the Middle East somewhere, right? Moving in and out of Israel, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, that kind of, right? So, sorry, wrong, point one. Not all the Jews were gone. Not all Jews are from Poland, okay? So point one, right there. Point two, I think it's irrelevant. I'm going to refer you back to my point about the Chinese person. You can be a Chinese person, you can come to Canada, you can live in Canada for 7 generations. Are you indigenous to Canada? Of course not. You're indigenous to China, right? Well, you're not telling African Americans that they're indigenous to Mississippi. That makes no sense. They're indigenous to whatever country their ancestors came from. Why is it Jews are the only group anywhere that doesn't get to say that? Why are we the only group that, well, I'm sorry you left, so you're no longer from there? Of course not. It doesn't make any sense. We don't talk about it like that, right? So I think it only makes sense if you don't want Jews to have an ancestral homeland. You don't want Jews in Israel, right? That's the only way that that argument makes sense, because you don't talk about any other group of people that way. You only use it when you're talking about Jews. So I would say that would be my second point. I think, you made another point about, the Palestinian people and their indigeneity in the region. Well, I already said, first of all, it doesn't matter if they were indigenous to the area. It wouldn't necessarily, listen, my tribe might have started here and your tribe started there, right? They didn't, but you can have 2 indigenous people in a region. Look at Canada. There's many different indigenous peoples in Canada. We're not saying like, oh, sorry, the Ojibwe people, you can't be indigenous to Canada because the Cree are indigenous to Canada. We're not saying that. It doesn't make sense. There's more than one indigenous group. However, in Israel, Palestinian Arabs, they call themselves Arabs. If you're calling yourself an Arab, you are not indigenous to Israel. Full stop. The end. Okay? If I'm calling myself a Chinese Canadian, I am not indigenous to Canada. It's in the name that I call myself. Palestinian Arabs are Arabs. Arabs are from a very particular region. It is not Israel. So the suggestion that it is their ancestral homeland and not ours is frankly so insulting that anyone would even give it 2 seconds of thought, because in their own name, it is not their land. They talk about themselves as Arabs. Arabs come from an area. It doesn't make sense. So that's what I would say. Did I miss any of the points?
No, I think that's I think that's.
I'm obviously angry about it.
No, it's comprehensive because there's 2 elements here. There is and that's where I think that perhaps it's food for thought to be able to say, well, there's the indigenous rights, understanding of what that means, and I think more than a superficial view, because I think that many of us have the understanding that indigenous means you were there since the beginning of time itself, or the first people there, and actually it's much more nuanced than that, and I think that's important. And also that in itself, discussing the Jewish people's indigeneity, and it was a great example we talked about here in North America, Algonquin and Mohawk, they don't preclude one another. That's without discussing, the Palestinians and whether that's, there's validity to that. So I think that's a critical understanding. And so I guess perhaps at this point we can, I certainly have a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, perhaps spending a couple minutes and asking any of those in attendance for questions for Amanda, please.
Okay, so first of all, I think that it's self-evident that we're an indigenous people, we're native to the land of Israel, and that Zionism was a tool to return indigenous people to their ancestral homeland, and begin the decolonization process of the Jewish people, return restore our language, which has been dead for thousands of years. And I just want to know what you think other steps are to internalize indigeneity, and what sort of ramifications are there. I mean, we have to avoid sounding like a colonizer, because we often do, and I'm just wondering where your thoughts are.
So I haven't fully fleshed out this idea. I haven't written about it anywhere. I haven't even really unpacked it for myself yet. But I think the first step, Zionism itself is a difficult concept. It's a difficult word when we're talking about this movement. I don't know where I want to go with that yet. It's an unformed idea. But I think Zionism has such baggage and such weight that when we're talking about the fact that it is our indigenous homeland, the Zionist movement has certain baggage attached to it. And it's difficult to try to use the Zionist movement to discuss this, because I think whether or not it is what it is, people think it's a white colonizers movement.
I think a big part of that is probably Herzl.
Yeah, 100%.
He wanted to colonize Africa in order to create a homeland for the Jewish people.
Yeah, and so I think it's a difficult, listen, I obviously am a Zionist, but it's a difficult thing to use that type of language when you're talking about this, just because it is so loaded with colonialist language, because it came from a time where colonialism was the dominant way of understanding the world. And so I think we in this generation need to come up with new terms. We need to come up with a new movement and new terms that is just as strong as the Zionist movement. Just the same way as Herzl and all of the lovely fathers of the modern state of Israel had their movement and their language and their words and their sort of motivating movement for the Jewish people to inspire them to move back to their ancestral land. We need to have the same movement, but for modern people, and using modern language with the words and the right vocabulary of what we're talking about now. And I just got a cue card, but yes, that's what La'ad is about. That's what our entire organization is this sort of modern day Zionist movement, if you will. And again, I haven't, because it's so much to unpack, I don't know what I'm saying about it yet. I don't have those words. I don't have that vocabulary and that language. And the way to really unpack it, as I'm sure Herzl did in the first, few months of when he started talking about it. But I think it's really important to understand that this is our generation's big fight, right? Is that this is going to be the thing for our generation that is important, that Israel is ours because we are the indigenous people, the end. So, is there any questions on the thing?
Thumbs up.
Just thumbs up and okay.
Right.
Okay, what's your question?
There was a recent article in the Canadian Jewish News suggesting that Jews could be indigenous to the diaspora.
It's nonsense.
Can you maybe unpack the idea why they would think such a thing and why it's not true?
Yes, I can. I think the reason that they think that is because they don't know what the definition of indigeneity is, number one. It's not where you were born. That's not where you're indigenous to. I'm not indigenous to Canada just because I was born here. So, no, Jews cannot be indigenous to the diaspora. The end.
I don't think anyone can be indigenous to a diaspora. That's an oxymoron.
By definition, the diaspora is where we are not from. That is the definition of a diaspora.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about Jews in the diaspora, it means outside of the place where we are from as a people. So the nonsense of that article, I just don't understand. I can't even begin to understand why someone would think those things. It doesn't make sense linguistically. It doesn't make sense historically.
Let alone why a Jewish publication would publish it.
Well, I'll leave that to the editors. But it doesn't, I mean, that's my version of unpacking that, is that it's a non-starter for me. You can't be indigenous to a place that you're not indigenous from. That's what diaspora means. So it's baffling to me.
So, okay, well, I think that's a great, point to end on, because, I think that the more we can understand what indigeneity means and what it isn't, because I think that if we were to ask people...
We have a question from online.
Okay.
The question is, how do you debate and argue against groups like IJV and these types?
Without naming any groups that I'm talking about at all, and those watching probably know my reasons, how do I counter to groups that like to say we are not the indigenous people, Jews are colonizers, we're stealing the lands of the indigenous people? That's the argument that these people make, is that Jews are stealing the indigenous lands of Palestinian people or the people who are indigenous to Israel. Well, I think I just kind of went through a few of them, right? That I always start with, okay, Jews are not from Israel. Let's pretend I believe you. Where am I from? Where are Jews from then? You tell me. And generally speaking, either they can't, they'll say, well, I don't know, but it's not there. Or they'll say something like, Poland or Russia or the Ukraine or whatever. They'll say some white country, and because Jews are white people. All right, let's pretend I believe that. So in my holy book, I'm not praying to Poland. I'm not praying to, you know, someplace in Germany or France. I'm praying to Israel, right? Every day, 3 times a day. Where am I praying, right? I am not praying to Poland. I'm praying to Jerusalem, right? So, you know, I can go through all of my points again, right? That, you know, Tanakh mentions Israel 641 times, right? It doesn't mention anywhere else 641 times. So the suggestion that I don't have a tie to Israel is pretty silly. I mean, I've heard well, Abraham was from Ur, which is Iraq, and so that's where Jews are from. I've heard that one a lot. I thought that's where you were going with the question earlier. Again, it's not where you were born, it's where your people became a people, right? So where did Hashem make the Jewish people into Jews? Where did Jews become Jews? It is centered around Israel. So we are not Jews until we go into Israel. We are not Jews until we can like build a temple and do all the stuff that Jews have to do, right? That's what makes us Jews. That's what makes modern day Jews, the people that we call Jews, that's what makes us into Jews, right? So it's in our own creation, you know, story, myth, whatever you want to call it, heck, depending on your amount of religiosity, but it certainly talks about where we became people. So,
well, but I think you had a valid point at the beginning, which is, you know, there's the facts and how to present it, but then there's sort of the rhetorical side. In other words, you know, in terms of how to present this, I think that it's important that when someone is making a claim such as, you know, well, the Jewish people have no historic or indigenous claims, you know, to the land of Israel, I think that Amanda said is critical and say, well, okay, you know, I understand that's your perspective, you know, punt it back, you know, please tell me, you know, present an alternative. I think that is very easy, and this is the same reality that we see. Well, what's happening here in the media and campuses is a microcosm of what's happening in Israel, right? You know, Hamas sends these fire kites, or they, you know, $400, you know, rockets made of some sheet metal, and they fire it off into Israel. They don't care what they hit. They don't care if they hit a school, a kindergarten, a gymnasium, whatever. Meanwhile, Israel fires these, you know, and again, I'm giving this analogy, Israel fires these Iron Dome batteries worth, you know, $80,000 to $150,000. It's asymmetrical because it's a lot easier to push a boulder down the hill than it is to push one up. And what our opponents are doing is they're throwing everything.
Yeah.
Israel murders babies. Israel stole the land. Israel commits genocide. Israel has apartheid. Basically, Israel does everything, you know.
All the ills of the world.
Right. You're late for traffic. It's Israel's fault, right? And I think that it's a lot easier to, like I said, push the boulder down the hill to say, well, you know, to basically just to throw shade, if you will, at everything that Israel is. But I think that the onus we have to push back on them in both in an intellectually honest way, but as well as in a rhetorical fashion, is to say, you know, it's very nice to sort of, you know, try to deny this, but what is your argument exactly? You know, you're saying that we have no rights here. Are Jews indigenous to Poland? You know, patently false. Are Jews indigenous to Ethiopia or Canada, you know, Brooklyn? I mean, you know, it's all patently false. So I think that it's very easy for our opponents, and we need to stop being on the defensive and need to push back a little bit. It's very, very hard to be on the, you know, on the offensive, but I think we need to do that because, you know, we can't let our opponents set the agenda.
I also think, and this I think comes from my years of doing advocacy for other groups, I am not shy to call somebody a racist. When you start making arguments like that, right? That like well, Israel murders babies in Israel this and Israel that. Well, you're a racist, and I'm done now. Like you're just an anti-Semite. Like those aren't facts. You're a racist. I have no problem saying that, and then let them defend themselves. Because it's kind of the like, when did you stop beating your wife thing, right? That like, there's no right answer to that. I am not a racist. Israel, you know, this, that, and the other thing. Okay, but those facts are false, right? So either Israel didn't do those things and you hate Jews, or Israel didn't do those things and you're going to admit it and you don't hate Jews. Like, you pick which one.
Well, we don't have to respond to every nonsensical claim and sort of give it credence. We need to be able to push back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's it. So thank you, everyone who's joined us virtually on Facebook in real life, and much appreciated. I hope this can be the beginning of more education moving forward. So thank you to Amanda from LAD Canada, and have a good night.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Ended with a pirouette or something.